In September 1939, as the Second World War began with the invasion of Poland, one small defensive position would become the setting of one of the most extraordinary last stands of the entire conflict. Near the village of Wizna, a narrow defensive sector protected river crossings, marshland approaches, and key movement routes across the countryside. On maps, the position appeared minor, almost insignificant compared to the vast front lines forming across Europe. But for the soldiers assigned to defend it, the coming days would transform that quiet landscape into one of the most intense defensive actions of the early war. The Polish forces stationed at Wizna numbered only a few hundred men, spread across trenches, reinforced bunkers, and improvised defensive fortifications built into open terrain. Their heavy weapons were limited, communication systems fragile, and ammunition supplies carefully rationed. Yet their mission was clear: hold the line as long as possible, delaying the advancing enemy and buying time for other defensive operations taking place across the country. Advancing toward them was an overwhelming German force composed of thousands of infantry soldiers, armored units, artillery batteries, and supporting aircraft. Long columns of tanks moved across rural roads while infantry formations advanced behind them, supported by heavy artillery capable of striking defensive positions from miles away. The imbalance in numbers and equipment was unmistakable. Still, the defenders prepared their positions, knowing that retreat was not an option. When the first artillery bombardment began, the quiet defensive sector was suddenly consumed by explosions, smoke, and falling debris. Shells struck trench lines, bunker entrances, and communication paths, attempting to break the defensive structure before the main assault even began. Inside the bunkers, soldiers held their positions while machine gun crews prepared their weapons, waiting for the moment when the advancing infantry would emerge from the smoke-covered battlefield. As the bombardment slowed, German infantry began advancing across the open terrain, using craters, smoke, and natural ground cover to move closer to the defensive lines. Behind them, armored vehicles rolled steadily forward, crushing defensive obstacles and providing cover for advancing troops. From the trenches and bunker firing positions, Polish defenders opened sustained defensive fire, forcing the attackers to advance cautiously while delaying their movement across the battlefield. Hours passed as repeated assault waves pushed forward under artillery cover, each new advance placing increasing pressure on the remaining defensive positions. Communication lines between sectors continued to fail as bombardments damaged cables and equipment, forcing isolated bunkers to fight independently without knowing the situation of neighboring positions. Yet, despite the growing confusion, the defenders continued operating their weapons with disciplined coordination, passing ammunition between firing points and maintaining defensive fire whenever advancing units appeared through the smoke-covered battlefield. German armored vehicles gradually moved closer to the defensive perimeter, crushing damaged trench systems and clearing obstacles that had once slowed the advance. Behind them, infantry units advanced cautiously, using terrain craters, destroyed fortifications, and armored cover to reduce their exposure while approaching the remaining bunkers. Each meter gained required effort, as defensive fire from the remaining positions continued forcing attackers to advance carefully rather than rushing forward. Inside the surviving defensive bunkers, the situation became increasingly desperate. Ammunition supplies were running low, communications were unreliable, and the surrounding defensive line had largely fallen silent. Even so, small groups of defenders continued preparing their remaining weapons, checking rifles, organizing ammunition, and reinforcing firing points that had been damaged during the bombardments. The confined bunker interiors filled with dust from repeated impacts, while distant explosions continued shaking the concrete walls surrounding them. As the battle entered its final stage, only a handful of defensive strongpoints remained operational across the battlefield. Surrounded and heavily damaged, these final positions continued firing across the open terrain, delaying the advancing forces for as long as possible. Machine gun crews fired controlled bursts to conserve ammunition, while soldiers rotated between firing positions and supply points, ensuring that every remaining resource was used effectively. Eventually, advancing infantry units reached the immediate defensive perimeter, forcing the final positions into close-range engagements. The remaining defenders continued resisting despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage, holding their firing lines even as surrounding sectors had already fallen. One by one, the last operational positions were forced to cease fire as ammunition ran out. When the final defensive fire faded, the battlefield slowly fell silent. Smoke drifted across shattered trench systems, damaged bunker entrances, and scattered defensive equipment left across the terrain. The intense fighting that had filled the region only hours earlier gave way to a quiet landscape. Although the defensive line had ultimately been overcome, the resistance at Wizna had delayed a significantly larger advancing force far longer than expected, forcing additional time, resources, and operational adjustments that had not been planned at the start of the assault. The defenders had fulfilled their mission of delaying the advance, demonstrating how even small defensive forces could influence the pace of large-scale military operations when positioned effectively. In the years that followed, the Battle of Wizna came to be remembered as one of the most remarkable defensive stands of the early Second World War. Historians and military analysts often compared the resistance to other historic last stands, not because of the scale of the battle itself, but because of the determination shown by a small defensive force facing overwhelming numbers. Today, the countryside where the battle once took place appears calm and peaceful. Fields stretch across the terrain where trenches once cut through the ground, and the remains of the battlefield are gradually reclaimed by time and nature. Yet beneath that quiet landscape remains the memory of the soldiers who defended the position against overwhelming odds, holding their ground long enough for history to remember their stand. Their resistance did not change the outcome of the invasion, but it became a lasting symbol of determination. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more forgotten battles of history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank you.